Hello everyone, I'm Luisa Rodriguez and I'm going to talk about the history of Canada from 1700 to 1798. So let's start. In 1700, Louis Joliet died. It is unknown exactly when or where. From 1701 to 1713, the War of Spanish Succession began in Europe. By 1702, it had spread into North America, where it was known as Queen Anne's War, in Acadia, Canada, and New England, United States. Francis Nicholson captured Port Royal for England in 1710, and in 1713 the Treaty of Utrecht ended Queen Anne's War. England gained total possession of Hudson Bay, Newfoundland, and Acadia, except for Isle Royale, currently known as Cape Breton Island. France immediately began building Fort Louisbourg near the eastern tip of Isle Royale. In 1730s, the Mississauga tribe drove the Seneca Iroquois out of Canada and into the United States, where they eventually settled south of Lake Erie. Also, the majority of Acadians had signed an oath swearing allegiance to the British crown, but they insisted they would not fight either the French or the native Indians. From 1731 to 1743, the LaVarentine family organized expedition beyond Lake Winnipeg in Manitoba. There they set up for trade routes with the East. Meanwhile, the Mandan Indians situated west of the Great Lakes began to trade horses which were descended from those originally brought into Texas by the Spanish. The Assiniboine Indians traded with the Mandans and took the horses into their own territory southwest of Lake Winnipeg. From 1744 to 1749, the War of the Austrian Succession began in Europe in 1744, spread to North America, where it became known as King George's War. Fort Louisbourg was captured by Massachusetts Governor William Shirley in 1745, effectively gaining control of Isle Royale. The Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748, however, returned the fort and the island to France, and in 1749 the British began to counter the French presence at Louisbourg, with Halifax being the center of operations. By 1750, a number of smaller independent bands of Indians had amalgamated into the Ojibwa tribe around the same time as a massive influx of German immigrants arrived in Halifax. On March 23, 1752, Canada's first newspaper, the weekly Halifax Gazette, hit the streets of the city. From 1754 to 1763, although not officially declared until 2 years later, the French and Indian War began in 1754 as part of the Seven Years' War. Due to the tension between the British and the French, first in the Ohio Country and later in Acadia, would make the policy of neutrality with the Cajuns untenable. The early battles of the French and Indian War were fought in the interior of the continent, where the French prevailed. The British were more effective in coastal actions, where they could be supported by the Royal Navy. The French built a massive fort at Louisbourg. It was a threat to the developing English colonies to the south. With the outbreak of hostilities with the French along the coast, the British sought to secure their hold on coastal strong points, and the Cajuns would suffer the consequence. In 1755, pressure from the English was strong. British Governor Charles Lawrence and the Nova Scotia Council decided in July to deport the Acadians, although Grand Pre to this day is the most well-known symbol of the expulsion. It actually began at Fort Beausejour on August 11th. About 6,000 Acadians were forcibly removed from their colonies. The British military ordered the Acadian communities to be destroyed, and homes and barns were burned down. The people were dispersed among the 13 American colonies, but many refused them and sent them on to Europe. Families were torn apart and many lost everything they owned. Acadians call this event the Grand Derangement or Great Upheaval. In English, it is the expulsion. The word Cajun derives from the word Acadian. Meanwhile, the British opened Canada's first post office in Halifax, and the Marquis de Montcalm took command of the beaten, demoralized French troops in North America. To make matters worse, the 7 Years' War between Britain and France began in 1756. Louisbourg fell to Generals Jeffrey Amherst and James Wolfe in 1758. The expulsion did not end in 1755. 3 years later, the Acadians who fled to Isle Saint-Jean, Prince Edward Island, and Isle Royale, Cape Breton Island, were rounded up and sent to France. The British under General Wolfe and General Amherst recaptured Louisbourg, the last French stronghold, and deported 3,000 more Acadians to France. The Grand Derangement displaced from 10,000 to 18,000 Acadians. Thousands more were killed. Wolfe went on to defeat Montcalm on the plains of Arran on September 13, 1759, taking control of Quebec from the French. Both generals were killed during the battle. In 1760, General James Murray was appointed the first British military governor of Quebec. Finally, in 1763, the French turned over all its North American possessions to Britain by the Treaty of Paris. A proclamation in October imposed British institutions on Quebec. Unfortunately for the Western Cree and Assiniboine traders who had benefited from trade agreements with the French, began to lose profits to the British. From 1764 to 1768, General Murray became the civil governor of Quebec in 1764, but all his attempts to placate the French Canadians were frowned upon by British merchants. Murray was succeeded by Guy Carleton as governor of Quebec in 1768. 1772 to 1774, the Hudson Bay Company opened Cumberland House. With Guy Carleton's help and input, the Quebec Act was instituted in 1774. By the Act, criminal law would be under British laws, but the French Canadians retained their civil laws. The Act also guaranteed religious freedom for the French Roman Catholics. From 1775 to 1784, the Quebec Act was so powerful and widespread that it actually incited the American Revolution, which began in 1775. On November 13 of that year, revolutionaries under the command of Richard Montgomery captured Montreal. A month later, on December 31st, Montgomery was killed during the attack on Quebec. Guy Carleton was able to withstand the American siege on Quebec until May 6, 1776, when a British fleet arrived and expelled the Americans southward. Carleton was later knighted for his efforts. In 1783, in Montreal and Grand Portage, present-day Minnesota, a group of trading partners formed the Northwest Company. The American Revolution had ended and the border between Canada and the United States was agreed upon by both sides, from the Atlantic Ocean to Lake of the Woods and then due west to the Mississippi River. Future surveys, however, showed that the border agreed upon was impossible, and a slight change had to be made through arbitration, as noted below. Thousands of United Empire loyalists, loyal to the Crown, were expelled from the United States. Some returned to England, but most moved northward in Nova Scotia. U.S. United Empire Loyalists were American colonists of British, Dutch, Irish, Scottish, among other origins, who had remained loyal to the king during the American Revolution. Ironically, many families in the colonies had divided their children of fighting age into revolutionaries and loyalists. That way, whichever side won, the family would be on the winning team. Unfortunately, when the loyalists were expelled from the states, many families were torn apart, suddenly becoming enemies of different nationalities. Meanwhile, also in 1783, the Pennsylvania Germans began to move in southwestern Ontario and eventually into southwestern Quebec. By 1784, however, the ranks of Loyalists in Nova Scotia had swelled to great proportions, and Nova Scotia was partitioned and the province of New Brunswick was created. Because of the lack of job opportunities, thousands of Loyalists set out westward, eventually settling all along the shore of the St. Lawrence River and the northern shores of Lake Ontario all the way to Niagara. Many permanent settlements arose from these initial settlers. From 1785 to 1789. In 1785, the city of Saint John, New Brunswick, was incorporated. Also, Fredericton opened the doors to a provincial academy of arts and science, the forerunner of the University of New Brunswick in 1859. In 1789, Alexander Mackenzie, under the sponsorship of the Northwest Company, set out for the Beaufort Sea by following what would later be named the Mackenzie River. From 1792 to 1798, George Vancouver began exploring and mapping the Pacific coast. Jay's Treaty, signed on November 19, 1794, was overseen by an American diplomat named John Jay. In this treaty between Britain and the United States, Britain promised to evacuate the Ohio Valley first, effectively marking the beginning of international arbitration to settle boundary disputes. The initial boundary, which was to extend due west from Lake of the Woods to the Mississippi River, was found to be impossible since the source of the river was considerably farther south of Lake of the Woods than had been thought. Finally, in 1798, a new fur trading company was formed to compete with the Northwest Company, capitalizing on the name and probably hoping to follow the merchants. The company was named the New Northwest Company,